Good morning, everybody. Leviticus 19 verse 18 reads this way. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So tucked away in this group of laws that let's be honest, if we've tried to read through Leviticus before, we know we can struggle to stay awake in, is this little nugget that will one day be identified as the key, or at least half of the key, to interpreting all of the law of Moses. It goes along with the first command, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Jesus will say on these two laws, which are really one law working together, hang all the law and prophets. If you want to understand all of the Old Testament, all of the laws of Moses, just start with those two laws. That includes the Old Testament laws about money, of course. So it's a very relevant verse for what we're studying. You see, we've begun this series about God's vision for wealth in your life. And we've learned that money really matters to God. It's central to the law of Moses, as we're seeing yet again today. It's constantly on Jesus' lips. And the reason is because love of money, and it is love of money, it's not the money itself. Love of money can consume us. It can cause us to destroy one another. It has caused us to do so. And ultimately, it robs from us. While the love of God as the center of our relationship with wealth actually brings about justice, meaning, and mutual affection. We've learned in past weeks that God does not want simply obedience from us. He wants all of us. He wants to do with us. And he has a purpose to show himself in our financial situation. And because these two things are true, a loving God could not possibly abandon us to be controlled by our appetites or the love of money. This issue matters to him because he is seeking to reconcile all of ourselves to him. I invited you at the very beginning of this series to understand that our relationship to God and wealth is so much more than legalism, a law that has to be fulfilled. It's an invitation to imagine what is possible with wealth when our imagination is informed by love. And moving from law to imagination is so essential in thriving here. Last week we began to study the Old Testament vision for the economy. I told you that to understand it, you have to seriously begin with the consideration that God is Father in Israel, Father over his beloved children. And as a father, he intends to host his children plentifully in his home. And his laws reflect the interest of a father who is training up his children into maturity with all the risk that such involves. And so we looked at 4 laws as a start. There is a law that every Israelite is to be allotted land in Israel. And that shows that God wants to give belonging to every Israelite, and especially God wants to give opportunity. He will give you the raw means to produce a living and to flourish. There is a law that one must pay back one's debts. And so, even though you are allotted land in Israel, you can lose it. And it even goes so far as to ending up in indentured servitude for 6 years if you cannot pay off your debts. You see, God will correct his children when their behavior is not right by allowing them to face the consequences of their actions. There is risk involved in the opportunity that God gives us. And then we looked at the third law, the law of Jubilee. And that is the 50th year in Israel when all the land goes back to the original owning family, regardless of what has been sold and what hasn't. And this shows that God intends for second chances in Israel. There's no doubt. And that the role of the successful is not to aim to own everything, because God has set a limit on how much you can own. At some point, you've got to give that land back. Instead, this is introducing us to the idea that there are constraints around the successful, and one of the constraints is a constraint of the heart, that they want to love their neighbor. They want to partner with the Father in helping their siblings get set right and grow. And then we looked at the law of the kinsman redeemer, where if you lost your land or were sold into indentured servitude, your closest male relative was encouraged to buy you back out of that problem. This clearly shows that we're responsible for one another to a very significant degree. There is mercy in the law. And also there's this recognition that sometimes evil befalls people even though they don't deserve it. You know, it's not as a direct result of your choices that your business has ended up failing. And so these kinsman redeemer are important to provide justice by setting things right. They have the means financially to set things right for those who have been cheated. Now, in all, these laws, as we left our last sermon, describe the home of a generous father who absolutely intends to provide for his children as they mature and who enrolls his most successful children in the mission of raising up their siblings. Today, I want to look at a few more laws that demonstrate this second part, our part in this, which is that God is clearly enrolling his prosperous children in an effort to establish his struggling children on their own 2 feet. Love your neighbor as yourself sums it up very well. First, I want to pause, and as we always do, invite the Holy Spirit to work and to speak and to move and to pray through us and to us today. Maybe not pray to us so much. If you have music of some form to worship along to, go ahead and do that. And remember this, that we are beginning this week to pray for our final persecuted church of the year, which will be China. And the Chinese church has seen a radical increase in persecution this past year. Let's pray for them to continue to thrive, which they are doing. Man, they estimate 1 million people come to Christ every year in China, every month in China. Let's continue to pray for our brothers and sisters there and for their powerful witness. They are, of course, also missionaries across the globe to regions that the West is not reaching well, very difficult regions. Pray for that too. And then, so pause and go ahead and do that. And now I'd ask you to pause around a couple of questions. Well, really just one this week. I did a good job. What does it look like to love someone else like yourself, in your opinion? Maybe you could give some examples. So pause and answer. What does it look like to love someone as yourself? Okay, so I said I wanted to just jump into some more laws that focus on love your neighbor as yourself. The first one I want to look at is the Sabbath rest, which begins Leviticus chapter 25. As you've noticed probably, Leviticus 25 is a chapter entirely about economy. It's not the only one, but it is a chapter focused on that issue. And the Sabbath rest wasn't just every 7 days, it was to be every 7th year. Every 7th year, the land that you owned was to lie untouched. It was not to be sown, and it was not to be reaped. And it may not be apparent what this has to do with love your neighbor. It definitely is a law that demonstrates honor to God. We're going to set apart this year in order to focus on God and expect him to provide. It definitely shows a respect for the resources he's given us. It shows respect to the land he's given us and the fact that it's come from him and he's our sustenance. And it was very functional. It allowed nutrients to be restored to the ground in that year off so that agriculture was sustainable in future years. But what does it have to do with love your neighbor? Well, this law reasserts 2 essential attitudes necessary for those who will produce merciful justice in God's land. Actually, I guess there's kind of 3. The first is this anyways. They will not be driven by unlimited consumption. We've already seen this with the law of Jubilee, but here again we see it with the 7th year rest. There will be boundaries to human ambition. And one of those boundaries is stop working the land on the 7th year. Every 7th year, people will cease. They'll practice moderation. They'll practice curbing and constraining their appetites. That's a massive part of the law's vision, is that we become self-controlled. It's a necessary discipline as well to treat one another properly. And practicing it, that is self-discipline, is necessary to practice in order to grow in treating one another properly. But it also naturally turns our attention to all of the parameters. Oh, I'm not to till my land this year. Oh, okay, that's all right. What are the other parameters God has set in place? Well, the chief one is care for your neighbor. So, in that sense, learning to control our consumption is a part of learning to love our neighbor. Secondly, The Sabbath year reminded Israel of another necessary condition for justice in the land. They should not be fearful of doing what is right. It was always God's intention to provide miraculously for those who would obey his laws in the Old Testament. Always required his miraculous intervention. The whole law is set up on the assumption that he will reward those who do right by his miraculous power. And so, for example, if we go back to the desert wanderings, in fact, that's where Moses is right now, we see that God provided manna miraculously to feed the people in the wilderness. But we also see this interesting thing about manna, that's miracle enough in itself. But if you tried to pick out 2 days worth of manna on any day but Friday, the day before Sabbath, by the morning, your second day's ration would be rotten and spoiled. You have to throw it out and start again. However, for no explicable reason, if you gathered, as you were supposed to, 2 days worth of ration on Friday, the day before Sabbath, the next day it would be fine under the same conditions, and you'd have enough for Sabbath and you wouldn't have to go out and work because God didn't want you to. Isn't that interesting? The same kind of thing is going on here with the Sabbath rest year. Israel, well, let me read here. What is this? Leviticus 25, verse 20. You may ask, what will we eat in the seventh year if we do not plant or harvest our crops? Well, God's answer is, I will send you such a blessing in the sixth year that the land will be yield enough for 3 years. 3 years. A bonus year on top of taking a year off. While you plant during the 8th year, you will eat from the old crop and will continue to eat from it until the harvest of the 9th year comes in. Isn't that fascinating? God's promise is, obey my law and I will miraculously provide what you need for taking that year off. I wonder if I could make this work every year. Anyways, God commits himself to overwhelming blessing as he does numerous times in the law. He takes responsibility for his laws and the people who follow them. So that's going to be important for everybody who's going to do right in the land, because it is costly. And you have to know there's someone. The world is personal, and that person is, in fact, seeing what you do and going to take care of you for doing right. Finally, part of the reason for letting the land lie fallow in the Sabbath year is that some crop would come up naturally, as it would today as well. And that was to be left for the wildlife and the poor. Okay, they were to be remembered. That would actually be a very bountiful year that year, because you wouldn't be competing with them for it. Really fascinating. Okay, so that's one law, a Sabbath year, which clearly revolves around love your neighbor as yourself. A second one is this. It's much like the Sabbath year. It's that when you go and harvest your fields, you don't harvest everything. You go over it once, you don't go back a second time. Anything that comes up after that first time is once again for the poor. When you reap the harvest of your land, this is Leviticus 19, I think is what it is, Leviticus 19. Do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Okay, anything that falls to the ground, anything on the perimeter, anything that comes up later. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. I guess you wouldn't employ a lot of clumsy laborers, because everything that hits the ground is no longer yours. Once again, there's this very clear message. Acquiring all that one can is not your purpose. Even acquiring all that is rightfully your own is not the purpose we're to aim at. God has set in place that we consider one another by restraining our consumption, and in this case, not restraining our work. The Sabbath year we restrain our work. This year we still do the work to produce that crop, and we don't take it all because of our love for those who need it. And God, once again, implicitly here I would say, takes responsibility that your first harvest will be sufficient for your needs. Just trust me. Third law, interest-free loans. Hey, did you know that some countries are actually, Sweden right now is offering loans they pay you to take? Well, that's impressive. I guess maybe that's one step ahead of the Old Testament. Oh, maybe that's blasphemy. Exodus 23:25 is a good example. If you lend money to any one of my people, isn't that interesting? Among you who is needy, do not treat it like a business deal. Do not treat it like a business deal. Charge no interest. Leviticus 29:36 and forward says much the same. Do not take interest or any profit from them, that is the poor, but fear your God, so that they may continue to live among you. You must not lend money at interest or sell them food at a profit. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. Boy, we should sit on that for a whole sermon. The poor are not a business opportunity. Good grief, I wish that we would remember that right now in our world. You care for them at your own cost, or in the case of food, at break even is fine. You fund their rehabilitation with your money. Here I mean their financial rehabilitation with your own money by giving them interest-free loans. It's on your shoulders to get them set back up again. You're to see that they may persist among you. Why? Because you fear the Father. You love the Father. And the Father has invited you to join in his purposes to reestablish his children. Now, recently, I've learned of missionaries attempting to help economies grow in poor areas by giving interest-free loans according to the biblical pattern. But what they found was that without interest, no one worked because there was no motivation to pay back the loan. They now charge a very small amount of interest, and what they've seen is that little motivation has caused economies to boom, to suddenly thrive. I mean, on a small scale here, but to really boom for the people, pulling them out of poverty. I wonder, is that contrary to biblical law? Well, I would say not at all. It's an example that those God enrolls even to this day to achieve his purposes are, first of all, they're still driven by his purpose of raising God's children up, not profit. Secondly, that we use judgment to this day. Even then, they had to use judgment with all these laws. How do we best apply them? It's not just a one-size-fits-all. They're very strong structures, but applying them. Do you give a loan to everybody? No, of course not. You'd have to test the plan, and you'd have to test the trustworthiness first. But third, even this interest-free law in the Bible actually held people accountable for paying back. It held them accountable to their actions, which is consistent throughout the Old Testament. Because if you didn't pay back this interest-free loan, this is the very one that if you can't pay it back, you'll have to sell off your land, and you won't have land anymore. And if you can't pay it off, you'll have to sell yourself into indentured servitude. That's a lot of motivation. I mean, that's way more motivation than 0.75% interest, which missionaries might charge today. It's really a significant motivator. And it doesn't cause people to escape this law of you reap what you sow. So, in the Old Testament, the motivation came from consequences as well. And we might note from these interest-free loans that the reason some of us experience abundance, apart from the fact that we have attempted to obey the Lord and done fairly well in that's real. That reaping what you sow still exists, even though it's not a perfect law in a broken world. Nevertheless, one of the reasons that some of us experience abundance from God's hand is to help set others on their own feet. In the Old Testament, you were required to think of the poor with these interest-free loans if you were capable of giving them. And I also want us to note this, though, that those interest-free loans were not gifts. Yes, there were gifts like not gleaning your whole field that could help sustain people day by day, year by year. But in order to move forward, it was not a gift. It wasn't just that you were given money to set you back on your feet. You were to pay it back. You were responsible for it. And so gift is not always the answer today either, I do not believe. Once again, though, before we leave this, I want you to see that God promises to fund the righteous one who gives the interest-free loan because he knows it's costly and risky. Deuteronomy 23, verse 20. You may charge a foreigner interest, but not a fellow Israelite, so that the Lord your God may bless you in everything you put your hand to in the law you're entering to possess. In other words, as you obey me in this interest-free law, I get to pour out more financial blessing on you. God is not ashamed to say that in his word. And we're going to see that to some degree that's true in the New Testament as well. Finally, okay, what have we looked at? We've looked at the law of Sabbath rest. We've looked at the law of not harvesting everything in your fields. We've looked at the interest-free loans. Finally, the tithe. Ooh, the chief one. And a tithe being a 10th part of what you bring in. See, there is not agreement on just how many tithes there actually were in Israel. There is agreement that it was definitely not just 10%, as we commonly think. It appears that there were 3 tithes for sure. There was a tithe to go to the Levites so that they could carry out their ministry of sacrificing for the people and teaching the law. So read Numbers 18, verses 21 and 24, for example. Levites were not to own, that is, priests, were not to own their own land or businesses for the very reason that they would not become distracted by them and leave the important work that God had given them. If that was the case, though, and they couldn't provide for themselves, they had to lean on the hard work of their fellow Israelites in order to persist. And let's face it, it was costly for fellow Israelites to set these people up to do this work. So this tithe fed them and their families. It appears there was a second tithe that as you bring in your crops, and it would happen throughout the year, as you would sacrifice to the Lord, the Levites actively there that day could feed that day from it as well. That's a second tithe. And maybe some of it went into the temple and temple repair. But there was then a third tithe every third year. Deuteronomy 14, verses 22 to 27. Oh no, that was the previous tithe. You can check that out. And then there was a third one for the poor every 3 years. And so in all, it appears that on top of Sabbath year's rest that you're going to have to take, interest-free loans, redeeming impoverished relatives, leaving portions of your harvest for the poor, so on and so forth, on top of all of that, Israel offered 23% of their gross income to the temple every year. This is a serious commitment. If we bought into the idea that the tithe was ever just 10% a year, we've been tricked, we've been duped, and we haven't seen the big picture. God was really serious about love for one another. It came at a cost. Generosity was a way of life affecting every aspect of a person's business and hope. And Israel was a land of opportunity, yes, where one was very much free to profit, but at the same time encouraged to use God's blessing to bless and set aright your neighbors. As excess came in, it was dispersed to those around you, mainly by free will, pretty well entirely by free will, and to my knowledge, without any legal reinforcement from any juridical system. The financially successful were thus recruited to serve their siblings in God's desire to see them flourish. So what is the picture we see from the Old Testament economic imagination after looking at these laws? A father seeks to see his children mature and prosper. Those who prosper first, out of their love of the father, are to love their siblings as well who are struggling and commit themselves to seeing them succeed, which will sometimes mean financial investment. The Great Commandment is lived out in wealth in Israel, as well as every other region of life. Now, I wonder how we're doing at this in churches today. The answer is some are doing very well, and most have not joined into this vision in any substantial way. That's a real loss for those who have not joined in. And not just for the poor among us, who then aren't taken care of as they ought to be, but for any of us who are financially sufficient and not participating with God, we are missing out on growing into the creation we were meant to be and the purpose that God wants to involve us in. For the most part today, the dialogue about finances and economy has been reduced to a political one. Should we be capitalists or should we be socialists/communists? And it's very strange to me that a people who themselves, us, are not willing to be the answer to our economic woes, believe we can just hand it off a little higher up to the government, even to the church, to solve our economic woes. Well, both will play a role in that, but they are not the primary answer, and the answer will never come until it starts with you and me. You see, the government never forms people into its own image. Even when it's trying to work in the population to socially engineer, as some have described it, the government is just a reflection of the people who produced it. So if you aren't going to be the answer to poverty, if you won't be the answer to poverty, neither will your government. No matter what its policies look like on paper, if you can't deliver righteousness, it will not deliver righteousness. It's just not going to happen. And the fact is that by biblical standards, there is likely no one I'm speaking to who would qualify as truly poor. Finances may be tight. I can really appreciate that. Some of us have less advantage than others. But if you are a Canadian, and there are very few who don't have this, if you are a Canadian who has a shelter over your head, clothes on your back, and food on the table, then you don't qualify as biblically poor. If you lack those things, I won't take anything away from you. Yes, you do qualify. But if you don't lack any of them, you would be considered biblically pretty well off. And most of us would be considered downright rich. And this is why I say this. You can't allow keeping up to the Joneses to rob you of God's invitation that is here before you today, even if you are not as wealthy as your neighbor. God is wanting to work alongside you. In fact, He's wanting you to work alongside Him. So you can't allow your perception of what rich is in your culture to turn you back from your calling, which very much exists today, right now. If you have more than enough, you have opportunity and motive to care for others, in as much as you are able, and to help those who don't have enough. You have an opportunity to do what's right, to reshape this land one life at a time, and that's the only way it's going to happen. We have to flee from a false sense of helplessness. We have to operate in God's economy if we're to be free. In truth, many times I have seen even those followers of Jesus who do not have enough, unquestionably don't have enough. They will sow, like that widow, their last 2 mites in honor to the Lord out of love for Him, only to watch Him lift them up. This doesn't break down just because of your personal poverty, even if your poverty is real. There really is nothing keeping anyone back from participating with our God. And as I say, when we each awaken to that reality and ask the Lord to show us how to do right, we change our people from the grassroots, not from the top down. This has always been the way of the gospel. As I say, when we speak of economy, we typically think within the chains of only 2 options: capitalism or socialism, communism. Neither of this, what we've seen described in the Old Testament, is fully opposed. Neither of these 2 systems are fully opposed to the biblical vision, except for Marxist communism, which sets out at the beginning to say it's a fundamental doctrine, God does not exist. That would be opposed to the biblical vision. But neither capitalism or socialism, communism captures the vision either. Like capitalism, and here I mean capitalism as it's supposed to be practiced, not necessarily what we've experienced, which has definitely involved some cheating in the last years, Israel flourished by private property and allowing a very open market. It emphasized merit. The one who does good should do better than the one who does not. It rejected equality of outcome as the final goal, though it did wish to share the wealth, there's no doubt. Unlike capitalism, the Old Testament economic mind was aimed at moral goods from the beginning to the end. Today, the market is often considered separate from morality. It's just a numbers thing that works out for the good of everyone in the end if you get morals out of the way. No. In Israel, the economy begins with a person, God, who blesses those who do what is morally right. He then enrolls those who flourish to aim not merely at profit, but quite restraining their own appetites. They are to aim at lifting up the people around them. It's morality, love of God and neighbor from start to finish. Business is unquestionably spiritual in the Old Testament's goals and methods for economy. In Israel, like capitalism, there was nothing wrong with becoming richer than your neighbor. In fact, it was generally seen as evidence you deserved to be richer because of your faithfulness to God. Now, there are real limits to that, but that is the general rule. And while it was also known that the cheaters sometimes prosper for a time for their cheating, and that happens today as well, of course, the fact is that even today, people usually become richer than others because they deserve it. They work harder. They bring something more to the table. This isn't something we should be ashamed of. The fact that people prosper because of right choices means they can be a blessing to their people. We can be grateful that righteousness flourishes and that we have these people, and in some ways, we find shelter in their wings, particularly when we struggle. They can be a kind of security if and only if their hearts are really turned towards God and their neighbor. Now, that is somewhat more complicated because many of us, for example, are called to fields where there's a limit to what one can be paid. Okay, so that does complicate matters. And where unrighteousness flourishes and the game is cheating, I know the righteous are not always rewarded as they should be. But to give up on the biblical vision that fundamentally in this world, at the raw, basic level, those who do good experience good, is to really throw out more than we realize. You know, this is so foundational to your daily experience that you can take it for granted and not even realize it exists. But there's a reason why you get up in the morning and go to work. It's because the exceptions are rare in which you get up and go to work and aren't rewarded for your right work. Otherwise, we wouldn't get up. It's true, by and large, that the one who invests an extra hour every day in their work sees extra progress in their business or in their role. Those shouldn't be denied. It would be oversimplification to remain at that, but it's still true. Anyways, that's all like capitalism. Like socialism or communism, at least how we perceive them as theories, because frankly, these two institutions have often been wielded as weapons for less than benevolent reasons. The law of Moses was deeply committed to the success of the whole community. It called for one to distribute excess to those in need with really lavish generosity. It called for costly generosity. Generosity at a level that was beyond simple calculation. It was risky to be that generous, in that it demanded so much only God could keep the righteous going by refilling what they gave out. And that's why God repeatedly promises he will do so. Unlike socialism or communism, the financial help you received was often based on your willingness to be set on your own feet and do what is right for yourself. Now, this is not usually the goal in socialist or communist regimes, and it's really not emphasized in them because they're usually populist movements that just want to win over the most support that they can get so that they can maintain power. However, if you break it down to the theoretical level, I think socialism often does aim at what's good. Unlike communism, certainly, the law was built on private property as a fundamental right. Communism diminishes. It removes private property. Unlike both, it was built on opportunity and risk. Intervention in the market by rulers was at a very minimum. Israel was built on the pursuits of individuals, not the guidance of a big brother. Likewise, rulers played little or no role in coercing generosity from citizens, like we see today in heavily taxed states. Each citizen was to choose for themselves to do what was right. The only exception here might be the tithe. But even that, we never see it enforced. Apparently, it was voluntarily offered. And I don't know of anybody who went around checking crops to make sure that you actually calculated your tithe right. This was about free will. A person's responsibilities were first to their family as well, and this is unique. First to your family, and from there to your neighbor. The kinsman redeemer law shows this. You take care of your family first. That's where your first line of responsibility is, and we're going to see in the New Testament this is confirmed in a couple of things as well. This is not usually true of socialism and communism. Those are top-down regimes. Dating all the way back to the Greeks, it was being good by force of a higher power. And in that, rather than taking care of your family first, deliberate methods have been used, especially in communism, all throughout history, to tear apart family identity so that your first identity and your first responsibility was to the state. That is exactly backwards to the scriptures. In Israel, power was spread out. It was spread out even in its official institutions. Kings, priests, and prophets ruled, and the three were there separately to hold each other accountable. And then the goal was to, well, even more fundamentally, spread out power between individuals. It was not to be concentrated, and that is part of the reason why private property was so important, was that it kept power in the hands of individuals. So it's much more difficult to abuse. Today we find ourselves caught in a transition. There has been a form of capitalism in the West which has been imposed on the world and has not been entirely benevolent, if we're honest. It has certainly fallen short even of theoretical capitalism, let alone the biblical imagination. Sadly, the official doctrine of capitalism, which is business is not spiritual, run an amoral market, just numbers and figures, and personal ambition as not being restrained by anything, that approach has caused people to suffer in very significant ways. And because of that, many have turned to socialism, the idea that government should fix it. Christians have to have a better response. Please hear me. You have to have a better response than that. The answer to the problems our society is facing financially right now is the person who is speaking right now and the person I am speaking to. Justice cannot be forced on a people. It has to come from the people. You don't rehabilitate a country through a government. You rehabilitate a country through the gospel reaching and transforming one life at a time. You are God's agent of repair. We cannot afford for you to abdicate that role out of distraction or a false sense of helplessness. The church needs to remember what is distinct about the church, the answer the church alone can offer because of the gospel, rather than reducing its moral vision, and this is what normally happens, to what is legal. Legal is not good enough for a Christian. Our vision of morality is bigger. The solution to what we're facing right now can't wait for the world to catch up before the church starts to solve problems by providing answers only it can give. Again, to summarize, the vision the Bible gives is a matter of a father enrolling his children to help his other children grow and succeed. And a father taking personal responsibility for those who do what is right so that they flourish and are able to lift others up. But in even deeper ways, God rewards us than just returning finances that are outputs, equal incomes for our outputs. There are rare times in the Bible where he does not reward, where he delays financial reward. And that's because he's actually rewarding us with something even deeper. Say perhaps as we get to the New Testament, the experience of Christ and his sufferings. Learning contentment in all situations. A real capacity for moderation. Anyways, as we approach this, we must remember it's a matter not of the law, but the law points us to an imagination. Gives us boundaries within which to operate our imagination. And each one of us gets to participate to whatever degree the Lord places in our hands. Because remember again our definition of wealth. It's the divine promise for God's children that you will have more than enough at all times to accomplish whatever He wants you to do. There is no reason for any of us to miss out on what He is empowering His children to do. Let's close with questions and prayer. Question number 1. What are 1 or 2 things that have really stuck out to you about the Old Testament law and its economic vision thus far? Are they examples that you can apply to your own life? Question number 2. When you consider the charge that you and not the government or some other institution are God's primary answer to economic turmoil, how do you respond? Is that encouraging, empowering, frightening, intimidating, disappointing? You tell. Number 3, when God makes numerous claims that He desires for us to do what is right financially so that He can cause us to prosper even more, what are your thoughts about that? Is this any different from a prosperity gospel that teaches us to serve God for financial benefits and teaches us that we can control those outcomes by conforming to His laws? And finally, number 4, how could you better step into the love of God and neighbor as we've gone through these laws right now, particularly as a matter of the heart? How can you bring your heart more along to that vision? Why don't you pause and discuss these questions? Finally, our prayer list, pretty much the same as last week. Let's continue to ask God that this study will affect our hearts and not just our minds. It'll change our imaginations, and we won't live the same at the end of this, that we'll increasingly walk into freedom and purpose beyond wealth. Let's pray for our nation where so many people are torn by the master of money, where they feel helpless because they don't realize where help comes from and empowerment comes from. Let's pray for transformation as a people. And let's continue to pray to God that He will turn back this season of the rapid spread of COVID. Last week, at the end of the week, it started to look kind of promising that things were turning around. Not so much this week. Ask the Lord to intervene for us. There's no point in giving up on praying that. Let's continue. Let's especially pray that He'll protect His churches from that so that they can continue to bring glory to His name and protect the community around us here in Clive as well for His sake. Well, thanks for being with us this morning, and I hope you're blessed. Go in peace, and we'll speak to you again. God bless.